Okay, that's better. That's much better. We have as our featured speaker. Well, before I mention this, I would like to say I heard from somebody with the Adirondack Park Agency that they would, Keith McKeever would like to, not right now, but as soon as our speaker finishes, spend a very brief amount of time, maybe 3 minutes, clearing up their policy on stormwater runoff regulation. I think that they feel that perhaps there's a misunderstanding about what they do in that regard, and Keith would like just a couple of minutes on that. We have as our speaker this afternoon probably the leading expert in the United States on conservation development. He's author of a great many books, and he's had quite an impression on me some years ago. One of his earliest books on the Connecticut River Valley in western Massachusetts, and how to develop right and how to develop wrong. He's calling it at that time conventional development versus creative development, and show graphically what's good and what's bad. And it's a wonderful approach, and Randall's been using this in many books since then to great effect. We're very lucky to have him here from Maine. Maine is where he lives, and I'm looking forward to your show. Randall, thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that is how to develop land as if the visions for the future really matter, as if the comprehensive plans we've written in our communities really matter. Because you go into any community that does have zoning and subdivision regulations, and look at its comprehensive plan policies and objectives, very, very seldom does the zoning and subdivision regulation match the vision and the policy, official policies in response to the comprehensive plan. Now, the EPA Act is like a zoning ordinance writ large for an immense area, encompassing more than 100 municipalities, as you know. I'm grateful for Keith showing us a really good example of conservation design in the town of Horicon. And that was the first example he showed of the two examples that were up there this morning. I would hope that in the near future, that approach would become the norm. That would become the default position that the agency strongly recommends through rulemaking powers that it probably has, without going back to Albany, to say that if you want to have a subdivision, we take very seriously all of the environmental considerations, and that we determined as an agency that conservation design is generally, almost always, the best way of achieving those objectives, environmental objectives. And if you want to do a conventional design, the burden of proof is on the applicant to show why cutting up all the land into fragments and extending roads and splitting up habitats better serves the environmental objectives of the Adirondack Park as opposed to conservation design. I think it should be the default position. I do a lot of development design for developers around the country and in Canada. And my developer clients tell me it makes them more money, they feel better about doing it, they often sell their lots faster, they sometimes command premium prices, and they have a bottom line which is better for them, it's better for the environment, and it's better for the community. So the Lake Tahoe triple bottom line test is met. And my developer clients tell me that all the time. I understand there are a lot of developers in a lot of places around the country, including the Adirondack Park, that don't understand that this is the best way to go. And I hope that the agency can adapt its rules so that conservation design becomes the default position, because it has been determined that this is generally the best way to go if we seriously want to achieve all our environmental objectives. I've written a number of books on the subject, as Dick mentioned. They're all on my website, greenerprospects.com. The commonality in those books is that we have a resource, and it's all zoned for development of one density or another, whether it's one house per 42 acres or one house per acre, anything in between. It's zoned for development unless it is permanently preserved otherwise. So all private land, inside and outside the park, throughout the state of New York, throughout North America, is zoned for development unless it has already been permanently preserved by a governmental entity or a land trust or something like that. So we have this wonderful resource from the villages and hamlets that exist in upstate New York, and none of these pictures are actually from the park. But they stand for the sort of the texture and character of development that makes our towns and villages special places. And in many of these towns, there in upstate New York, there are town commons and greens as there are throughout New England. That would be from Westfield out in western New York. And this would be from Chautauqua. Back to New England, where I've been based for most of my career, the town common in South Amherst serves many purposes, including the community picnic. I don't know where that would be held if we didn't have common ground for it. These community resources are hard to overestimate. In Brunswick, Maine, where I live now, they use the community, the town green for skating all winter long, as well as for farmers markets from May until October. We have 2 farmers markets per week on that space, and we have another farmers market on a farm just outside of town. But as long as development is allowed under regulations, to be as unimaginative as this, and this is the case in the Adirondacks. You allow this. As long as you allow that, expect that kind of development to occur when the developer comes in and says, that's all I'm comfortable doing. I don't want to hear anything different. You allow me under your regulations to do this by right. When I deal with towns and townships and villages, I typically say to them, rezone your land so that conservation design is the only by right option, and conventional development is a conditional use, and you can only get the conditional use when you make a clear and compelling case in a public hearing that it better implements key comprehensive plan policies and goals and objectives. You get a lot of compliance then when you are clear and straight with everybody that this is the way that development should happen. I've never seen a way to develop better than conservation design. It can be done at any scale. If this is acceptable in the Adirondack Park Agency, don't change your rules. I think you need to look at changing your rules. Maybe there should be an orientation session for the general public and particularly the commissioners who are in a position to sort of implement some change that they can implement without going to Albany. If this is the default position, the Adirondack Park Agency, are you ever going to have the majority of your development become better? Now in the hamlet, I would suggest that maybe this would be half-acre lots with water and sewer, 20,000 square foot lots. They could be reduced to 12,000 square foot lots and have 40% open space. I'm going to show you this at a range, and I'll end with subdivisions that are 10,000 acres. But this might only be 5 or 10 acres in a hamlet. And it's the same number of lots, and there's more value there for the developer. There's more value there for the community. Clearview Estates is a development in Randall, Maine that was the first to be implemented when they changed from 1 acre zoning to 2 acre zoning The purpose of the zoning change was to preserve open space and rural character. Well, all that happened was lots doubled the size and halved the number. And half as many lots filled up all of the land because there was nothing in it, in the laws to say you can't spread out from one end to the other. There is no constitutional right to sprawl. There is no constitutional right to have wall-to-wall house lots. There may be a constitutional right to have the economic value of your property, and that may be translated into a certain number of house lots, but there's no right to spread them out. So that community, after they saw what simply increasing the lot size and decreasing the density got them, changed and it became the first town in Maine to require conservation design. New York State, by the way, is the only state in the country where the legislature in Albany has specifically authorized municipalities to require clustering if they so wish. Towns and villages separately, under separate laws, have been authorized for the last 15 to 20 years by the state legislature to require clustering if they so wish. Now, there are other ways to encourage it, as I just said, by reclassifying conventional to a conditional use and classifying conservation design as a by right permitted use, which is what developers typically like to have. This is an example of 3-acre zoning, and it's in a rural Connecticut town that has a historic core. And I don't know what the Planning and Zoning Commission was thinking. How can we destroy as much farmland as we can with the smallest number of homes? How can we prevent any neighbor from knowing each other? Maybe you should issue with bullhorns when they own their house so they can communicate to their neighbor from one backyard to another. I don't know. It gets out of hand. I don't mind low-density zoning. In resource areas, I favor low-density zoning. These are 5 to 8 acre lots in suburban New Jersey. 5 to 8 acre density is a good objective, maybe in Hunterdon County, New Jersey, which is largely rural. But 5 to 8 acre lots is a flawed policy. And as long as rules allow that by right, it's difficult to change it. My wife grew up in New York State in Dutchess County, and when she was going to elementary school, entering elementary school, that part of Dutchess County looked like that. It was largely open. By the time she was a junior in high school, that part of Dutchess County looked like this. Wall-to-wall subdivisions, with each subdivision wall-to-wall house lots. The only open space, see, I don't know, do I have a pointer here? Separately on top of the lectern. Aha. The only open space in this, if you look carefully, are the playing fields around the middle school and the wetlands along the creek. So if you happen to be a 10-year-old or a frog, you're all set. This is the triangle zoning or planning. Planning never envisions this. But if you have this in the Adirondack Park Agency area, if you have that outside the blue line from Long Island to Erie, there's something missing in the rules and regs. And that something is a standard that makes conventional development really, really, really difficult for an applicant to achieve. Because conventional development almost always gives the environment the short end of the stick. There's no farmland preserved, no woodland preserved, no wildlife habitat corridors preserved. A rural town I work with in western Massachusetts, we don't have a problem. There's a lot of open space up here. Well, what they didn't realize is that their zoning was putting them on a track maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now to look like this. Because until the zoning is implemented, you don't know its flaws. As long as it's just words on paper, it's hard to drive around your community and understand what the impact of the current regulations are until somebody proposes something that cannot be turned down. So this is a build-out map, and it showed that community that its zoning was taking down the wrong path on a collision course with the comprehensive plan. This is from a booklet on how the Catskills were being subdivided in the 1980s and 1990s. Piano key lots. We're no stranger to them up here in the Adirondacks. I've worked with a lot of communities in the Philly suburbs when I worked for the National Land Trust in Media, Pennsylvania. And one of our communities was West Vixen Township, and we did a township-wide map of potential conservation areas. The dark green, almost black, were primary conservation areas, meaning they're wet, flood-prone, they're very steep. In other words, they're protected because of their resource characteristics. And all the other land was either developed, and that would be white, or green or yellow, and those two, green or yellow, would be two different classifications of undeveloped land, broadly speaking, farmland and woodland. So that community worked with National Lands Trust, and when I was an employee there during the 1990s, and we helped a lot of the communities adopt conservation design ordinances where that was the default position. So if you want to preserve farmland, you group the homes in the woods, and if you want to preserve the woods and particularly the water quality, you move the homes out of the woods from the previous picture and put them on part of the farmland, but not close to the road, so that you would be disturbing the public viewshed, and you'd be giving the homes more privacy themselves, and not close to the lot line with the farmer next door, because the farmer next door really doesn't want to have a bunch of suburbanites right on his property line. So there are ways to group or cluster the homes consistent with the environmental values in the officially adopted plans. We put a great stock in an existing features and site analysis map that the developer and his engineer and his landscape architect prepare before a site walk is done. Site walk is done by the planning board and the developer and his team. And we like to invite the abutters as well, so that they're not excluded from the discussion process as it begins in its formative stages. And after the site walk, we typically have a sketch plan produced. Rather than the first plan that the developer gives the planning board being a preliminary plan with $50,000 worth of engineering, well, we like to begin with a very simple plan with a low cost, so the developer hasn't gotten the right concept to begin with. He hasn't lost a lot of money backtracking. So it's very important to begin with the site analysis map, the site walk where planning board members really see what's on the property, and then the sketch plan before you get to preliminary plan, because the preliminary plan is far too expensive for developers to just simply walk away from it and say, well, we'll start over again. So site walks are terribly important. This is one we did out in Sheridan, Wyoming a few years ago. This is Wellington, Connecticut. Planning board members, conservation commission members, as well as abutters. It's a good time, it's informal, it's advertised as a public meeting, so the sunshine law is being observed. We get to see things out there like vernal pools, whether it be in the spring, when the light is beginning to emerge from eggs, or in the fall, when they are dry depressional areas. We get to see outstanding woods and see which woods might have the most special characteristics if a parcel is totally wooded, or are there some parts that have more special vegetation patterns. This is Trillium from a woodland near Rochester. The developer wanted to put the homes in the woods rather than in the farm field. And the wildflower blanket was thick throughout these mature woods. And the farmland would not be farmed for much longer under any circumstances. So I said, why don't we put the homes in the farmland and preserve these fine woods? No, I really want to put the homes in the woods. I happen to know, he was a repeat client, that he had gone to a Jesuit high school, and then he had gone to Loyola University. So I said, Chuck, do you know what plant this is? And he said, no, I don't. What is it? He said, what's a holy plant? So what do you told? And it's a trillium. Look, it's got 3 petals, it's got 3 leaves, it's a trillium. And in medieval times, if a person disturbed this plant, he'd go to a bad place and he'd die. Now, you know, it's up to you where we put the homes. I can be totally shameless when it comes to persuading a client. The homes all went in the on the farmland, which would not be farmed much in the future. If it's a hedgerow, or it's a solitary tree, or it's then that could be a wonderful. I'm designing a Y-shaped intersection there with that sycamore tree right in the middle, in Louisville, Kentucky area, or a farm lane, part of the cultural landscape. Cultural landscape includes stone walls and cellar holes and barns and dry stone wells. This is part of the cultural landscape too. The developers always pay to have surveyed. Why don't they also pay a little bit to survey some of the value-adding aspects of the property so they won't inadvertently destroy them through a cap-handed kind of conventional development that is not sensitive to the resources because no one knows where the resources are. That's the importance of doing a very thorough resource inventory from the get-go before even the site walk. Some of the pictures from the Atlantic Valley Design Manual that Dick remembers from years ago are this, and this is an existing situation, and this is the way that the community has zoned it. This would be probably in western Massachusetts, and this is a way of getting that same density on less land and preserving the whole riparian corridor. So we go from this to that to this. And it's always a choice. And sometimes when we go to smaller lots, we don't have a public sewer, we need to find places to put the wastewater. So the idea of having an off-lot individual drain field, shown in green, becomes a solution to the problem because we need to reduce house lots below the size where you can have both a well and a septic system. Well, let's put either the well or the septic system off-lot in the common open space. There's a 4-step design process that is really important, and if that can be put into the kind of rulemaking as an amendment to the rulemaking process at the APA, that would be terrific. Here's an example from the Conservation Design for Subdivisions book showing an existing situation, and the yield plan. It's a realistic yield plan, shows that realistically the developer could get 18 lots, 7 of which are shorefront lots, shoreland lots. If we want to do a conservation design, we'll begin the 4-step process with primary conservation areas, meaning unbuildable, then the secondary conservation areas, which are buildable, but there's some add value, and maybe we should not just cut up into pieces, like the sandy beach and the headlands. And at the top there's an esker, and there's an old barn foundation, and there's this lovely meadow in the middle. Well, and there's views out to the water. Once we subtract all of that out of the area for development, we can say, where would we put those 18 lots? And the answer is in the yellow area here. So step 2 is how do you get those 18 lots in the yellow area with high value? And so on the little black dots show the 18 houses. The 3rd step in the process is to connect the dots with streets and trails. And the 4th step is to draw in the lot lines. So we have a development that preserves everything that really should be preserved in the property, from the viewshed along the road, to the glacial features, the historical, cultural, and now we have 9, not 7, 9 lots with water views, and a sandy beach that all 18 families can use, meaning the interior lots have more value than they would have in this alternative. Why would you want to buy an interior lot there? You can't get to the water, you can't enjoy the beach, you don't have a view of anything in particular. But the conservation design gives people in the interior views of the meadow and access to the water through trails and the beach. Plus, 9 lots, not 7, have water views. And also, the road is shorter. So tell me how this is possibly a burden to the developer. He wins. And if a developer doesn't understand that, and we can't persuade him of it, that's when we need the rules that say, you're not just going to have a by right, to do this, because we know that this is far better. So this is conventional design, and this is the conservation design alternative, and that's a close-up. This is another close-up. I don't think we're doing any more of this around the lakes in the Adirondacks. It's legacy. Anything going forward probably should look a whole lot more like this, obviously. One lake in Michigan was developed in the 50s and 60s with a green belt around it, because the estate of the person that had created this as a nature preserve, the estate required the developer to have a green belt, even before the town had much zoning. And there's a green belt around that entire lake. It's Dunham Lake. It's written up in Rural by Design if your town's got a copy of it. It's a wonderful community where no one owns down to the water. And everybody in the community has these, and can enjoy these trails and the beaches and the swimming and the fishing. Look at the development on the other side. I mean, you can't see it. Look at the development on this side. You can't see it. So this is just a t-shirt showing a conservation design, but the back of it is a little bit more interesting. The number of agencies that got together to co-sponsor this workshop. The Realtors, the Institute of Architects, the Council of Governments, the County Department of Development, County Engineers, the Home Builders Association, the Land Conservancy, State University, Saltwater Conservation, folks that are hardly ever on the same page together, are on the same t-shirt together saying, this makes sense. Makes sense environmentally, makes sense economically, makes sense for the community. It's a triple bottom line, win-win-win. I often do hands-on design exercises when I've got a full day workshop. These are ranchers in the hill country west of Austin, Texas. They get it. It's a really simple concept. They sit through like an hour and a half of my talk, and then they're out there moving houses around on paper, designing their conservation subdivisions. The Merrill Farm, just a 10-lot subdivision north of Portland, Maine, and the developer came in with this, and the town planner said, well, we really need to look where your primary and secondary conservation areas are. And the developer said, what are they? And well, let's look at the soils and the topo, and we'll figure that out. And the developer said, where would I put the houses? He said, well, how about this? And the planner did this, just between him and the developer in an afternoon. They walked the property and they came up with a quick little sketch. And the developer says, I like that. It's a short road system, everyone's got a great view, and he seemed to like it, so it'll probably go through the system quickly. He said, yeah, it probably will. And it's a good thing you like it because we don't allow the alternative anymore. Everyone was happy. This is the first community in Pennsylvania about 20 years ago to adopt growing greener conservation by design ordinances. And the way they got compliance, and I don't think you can do this without going to Albany, so this is not what I'm suggesting. They said if you want to do a conventional, in the 2-acre zone you've got 4-acre lots. That's for conventional. But you get your full 2-acre density with conservation design. This is a transfer development scheme that I did in Randall, New York, that didn't require TDR ordinances because everyone was contiguous with everybody else. When you don't have that contiguity, you need a TDR mechanism. New York State has got one of the most complicated TDR enabling ordinances in the country, according to a land use attorney I know. So I can say, if you give me your business card, I'll send you a chapter from my new book on TDRs and conservation subdivisions. I'm sort of running out of time, so I want to just move quickly. But actually, these are the middle and the bottom are two ways to get the same density on a rural road, and it's a very, very simple example of how we can create a little bit of a neighborhood on one end and separate them from the the manure pile and the farm, the barn on the far left, and leave half of the frontage as scenic roadside, rather than looking like this. When communities allow developers to back their homes up to roads in unwooded situations, they can be very ugly, but I probably shouldn't have included this because there are not that many unwooded situations up here. But you can look at the top and the bottom. There are no lots that back up to the road in the bottom example. And it's a way of getting the same number of homes on a property, pretty much with the same density, and pretty much with the same open space, but the open space is used as a buffer between the development and the roads, which is particularly important when there's an unwooded situation. Conservation design can be used with attached buildings as well as detached buildings, be used with mixed uses. This is an example where the homes were clustered in the woods to preserve the fields in a high-value agricultural area in Bucks County, where the barn and the farmhouse on the upper right-hand corner were preserved with contiguous farms, which were converted to tree farms, called Indian Walk, and that's the tree farm that replaced the corn and soybeans, and the homes are all clustered on this short cul-de-sac in the woods, and they are served by a community septic system, which is there, but it could easily have been individual drainage fields. That's another view of the nursery, where they're growing shrubs rather than trees, and across the road on the upper left-hand corner is the farmhouse and barn. This is an example for affordable homes, but you approach it through a driveway, a street, which you can see there, the street, that makes it look like a very expensive neighborhood. And this is the view shed that it has that you still see there after development, rather than having it filled with houses. It's just a tree-lined street. Now, I said this is kind of affordable because you can see the homes are basic starter homes, and conservation design does not just have to be for people that are quite well off. The lot line goes to there, and then this is 300 feet from there to there. It doesn't look like it, but it's 300 feet from their lot line to the next farm over there. This farmland has, for the last 25 years, continuously been managed as a hayfield. I think there's some harvesting pictures here. Very small subdivision, so this one has 6 lots. Notice the flag lot, the tree farm there. I'm going to rush through. That's your stormwater management area, and it doesn't look like a hole in the ground. It is a very low, extensive, almost flat area that is allowed to grow up into your normal wildflowers and wild grasses. So it's a good conservation area as well as a great infiltration area because it is so broad. It's very shallow, but it's very broad. And that's the tree farm that's in the back of that subdivision. And this is the road leading into it. These are about 50 houses on 300 acres, 2 hours outside of Washington, D.C. farm colony. And farmland has all been preserved. And most of the woods have been preserved. The only land that's developed is the land at the bottom edge of the woods to get views over the farmland. But all these slopes are preserved and all that farmland is preserved. And this is about 35, 40 years old, the subdivision. So it's one of the older conservation subdivisions in the country. It's in my Growing Greener book and the Rural by Design book if you have them in your local library or planning board or planning commission. The view from the verandas is a view of permanently preserved open space. You've got a 5-minute lawn here instead of a 5-hour lawn to mow. Because it's normally a 5-acre zoning district, and if you have tried to mow 5 acres, it'll take you close to 5 hours, unless you got a tractor. So it's a good example. Also in Virginia is Birch Hollow Hamlet, Dobbins Creek Hamlet in Loudoun County. And interestingly, the common open space is dark green, and the non-common open space are 3 large conservancy lots, never to be further subdivided. But it's a way that developers can extract a lot of value So these are high-value multi-acre lots, like 15, 20-acre lots, in a context where the zoning is only, I think, 3-acre zoning to begin with. So these are very special, and they have preserved the viewshed along these roads. The development is grouped in a little hamlet in here. The common open space runs all through there in the dark green. But this non-common open space is preserved in perpetuity just as well. But it's not, open for the residents to walk over. So these are some pictures from Birch Hollow Hamlet, and these are some of the walking trails through the meadows in the common open space. Dobbins Creek Hamlet, same thing, same county, same zoning for conservation design. This is Twin Buttes outside of Randall, Colorado, and it is not yet built. That's the reason it's called Twin Buttes. Hidden Springs outside of Boise, Idaho, another conservation design from the west, where they kept the houses. They built a hamlet, and it's great. They have a limited development in the foothills. This is the Varian Ranch from San Luis Obispo, California. The Varian Ranch and the Biddle Ranch and the Edna Ranch are two ranches that were developed under their rural clustering ordinance. Each one of them had, altogether they had about 8,000 or 9,000 acres, and altogether, it's a low density. They had about 185 units on about 8,000 acres, 95% open space. Gorgeous, gorgeous landscapes, very different from the Adirondacks, but the same principle at work. This was the normal density there, because they, like their 40-acre zoning, they have some very low density. This is Cocomish Farms, development under design in Mason County, Washington, western Washington, and that had 760 acres. That was divided into 19 house lots, 5 acres each. It's about 75% open space. Not built, but all sold. It was done just as the recession was beginning, and it sold out, but development is not in the ground yet, but the developer's got all his money. Galisteo Basin Preserve, the last examples, 13,000 acres, 965 units, tightly clustered. This Storm Mountain Ranch, similar type of density. And I might mention the Santa Lucia Preserve, also in the west, 18,000 acres, 298 units, and 10% of the land. So whether you're dealing with a hamlet infill, or you're dealing with thousands of acres and a big development, conservation design can be done, and it's usually cheaper for the developer for a whole host of reasons. And I look forward to my next trip to the Adirondacks, hearing that Keith was saying it is now the norm. It's not a special example that is a very good example, but it's now what we normally do all the time, because our rules have been configured to affect this kind of result. Thank you.
Thank you, Randall. It's a great message that you left us with. Keith McKeever would like to have just a couple of minutes to say something about stormwater runoff control.
Thank you. Overtime day today. Carl was correct. The word stormwater is not in our rules and regs of the EPA Act. Stormwater runoff is, erosion, sedimentation, they are part of our development considerations. We have 2 engineers on staff. We require stormwater plans, control applications, engineering plans. We do manage stormwater from the water above. Thank you.
And now, we will move on. We'll skip the break. I don't think we need a break yet, do we? Too many breaks here. And so we're going to move on to our next chapter on conservation development and design, which we've been very well prepared for by our guest speaker. And the panelists will include Haley Glennon, the Wildlife Conservation Society Adirondack program. He's going to talk about the need for ecological analysis. That's one description for it. That's the first step. Always should be the first step in the development process. Dave Cox, who's chairman of the Town of Dade Planning Department, will speak on his town's viewshed protection area. A great step forward in preserving uplands. In the Adirondacks, the Town of Dade, and with help from the Adirondack Park Agency out my day. Dave Gibson, who's a partner in Adirondack Wild, is going to speak about some of the APA's accomplishments in conservation design. And then Carlton Montgomery, who's executive director of the New Jersey Pinelands Preservation Alliance, will speak on model clustering ordinances. And Phil Brown, Adirondack Explorer editor, will moderate this panel. And now I guess we have to get to panelists. Start one at a time, putting on the presentations down here. And we have Haley coming up first.
Thanks. I'm going to do the tough job of trying to follow Randall and talk about ecological site assessment or natural resource inventory or diversity. Label you would like to give it the process of assessing the site first before we do development. I promise I'll talk way too fast because I always do and because I'm afraid of that big timer. I want to set the context just for a minute in terms of thinking about why we would do an ecological site assessment, which I think in some sense we don't need to talk about too much. We're all here for the purpose of the idea that we need to make some changes, and probably we need to make some changes because we have somewhat of a communal sense that we aren't doing an adequate job of protecting resources. So to some extent, if we're going to think about assessing resources and doing development differently, it's for the purpose of protecting things in a better way. And I think the way that I would phrase that is, to some degree, to get beyond sort of the vague notion of open space. Much of what we have in terms of development now has been formed around the idea of protecting open space. And stand on any mountain, I think you could say we've done a good job of protecting open space. But I also think that if we look at conservation biology, what's been learned in the past 30 years or so, we can do a lot better in terms of putting some parameters on that open space and how we arrange it to better serve ecological connectivity and functionality. The response I always get when I start talking about some of these things is, this is the Adirondacks. We're not the same as everywhere else. We have so much state land. Who even cares what we do on private land? Because we have 3 million acres that's forever wild. Why does it matter about any of this stuff? So I'm going to ask you to come with me just for a couple of slides on a journey to talk about what we do have on the private lands and on the public lands and why such an assessment does matter. This is a habitat map of the Adirondacks. It's an amazing map. I could talk separately for an hour about this map, but it was created by some folks at the Nature Conservancy. It's a map that actually extends all the way from West Virginia up into Maine. So you can now look at habitats throughout the whole of the Northeast U.S. And if we take those habitats, as we have done, and look at where they occur in the Adirondacks on protected and unprotected land, we see some really interesting patterns. So don't worry about the dots on here for a second, but just pay attention to the proportions in the green, which is state land and easement land together, and the unprotected, which would be private land without any easement. And look at the distribution of those habitats. And you'll see, as I do, I hope that there are some of them that have a whole bunch of green. Those are lands where we have almost all of it, or large proportions of it, in state ownership or an easement. There are some, however, that are almost entirely distributed on private land. If we draw a line across here, that's 50 to 60%. We can sort of distinguish and say, there's some habitats that are somewhat equivalent. We have them well represented on both. But there are some that are very highly skewed toward one or the other. If you then look at the dots on this graph, those are the proportion of all of our vertebrates in the Adirondacks that would use those habitats. So we have 260 or 280 total species in the Adirondack Park, and if you look at the habitats that they would use, the proportion of them that would use some of these is really strikingly different across this gradient here. You can look at, and see some interesting patterns whereby we've got the rocks and ice, pretty well protected. The alpine, the rocky stuff, the scrubby stuff at the tops of the mountains, as happens in all protected areas around the world, is well protected. It's highly, highly represented in the state land. But it's not used by that many things. It's not ideal habitat for too many species. At the other end of the spectrum, there are some neat habitats. And if I was a creature that was particularly fond of central oak pine communities or central hardwood swamp communities, I'd be paying attention to the fact that those habitats, in fact, are disproportionately represented on private lands in the Adirondacks. Oak is a hugely valuable wildlife food species. It draws in critters from far, far distances. So these are the kinds of habitats that I think should trigger, or should at least be paid attention to in any sort of site analysis. You can look at where they're distributed, just those few that I highlighted there, and you can see that these are very small percentage of the park landscape. They're in very, very tiny acreages. TNC would never form any sort of acquisition strategy around a 2-acre parcel of central hardwood swamp. They're not on the state land, by and large, but they have high value for wildlife. And sort of the framework of how development is done right now is unlikely to capture these kinds of features. So this is an example of the reason why an ecological site assessment can be absolutely critical prior to the development process. So again, I'm going to talk a little bit about the scale. I think we can talk about a site assessment or a natural resource inventory on a lot of different scales. I'll talk about some examples of how we might do this and how it might be done well and done not so well. And maybe start to think about who should be doing this. What I think we want to start by asking, what are the things that we would hope an ecological site assessment could do for us in the Adirondacks? One is to meet some stated conservation goals. So if you're the Nature Conservancy, you might have very specific goals for kinds of lands that you want to protect. If you're the Wildlife Conservation Society, you might have wildlife targets, populations of animals that you're worried about. If you're the Adirondack Park Agency, you might look to the APA Act for the kinds of conservation goals and ambitions that you have for protecting this landscape. I think, in particular, we want to focus on individual habitat types, like some of the ones I just talked about that we know are important. We might want to focus on particular species. I personally would argue that going beyond just the threatened and endangered species, and maybe thinking about species of greatest conservation need, which are identified by New York State, identified by every state in the nation, would be a good starting point. You might worry about particular landforms. And I think more importantly, we want to also think about not just individual sites, but how we can put these things together to protect ecological function and things like connectivity. So thinking about scale for a minute, and thinking about very large scales, we can in some ways view the land use and development plan, the fruit salad map, as an ecological site analysis. It was done with an underlying understanding and tremendous knowledge of the ecological conditions in the park. It puts things in specific areas, it sets densities, it was very forward-thinking in its time, very McCartney and great in the time that it was created. I think there are ways that it could be improved now, but it is an example of a large-scale prioritization to some extent. Another example of the project I just talked about, which we're affectionately calling the Where Stuff Is project, which I presented at the ART conference, and we're now writing up for the Adirondack Journal of Environmental Studies. But that's another example of sort of a gap analysis way that you might go about thinking about prioritizing and assessing the whole of the park on a landscape scale. And lastly, I just want to highlight some other ones that are out there. The Nature Conservancy primarily has an ecoregional assessment that's tremendous for all of the northern Appalachian Acadian ecoregion. They also have done some modeling of what they call terrestrial resilience, which involves a couple of different layers. This is a layer called local connectivity. So it's a measurement of the degree to which our landscape and everything down to West Virginia is permeable. You could use it on any scale to look at ecological connections and local and regional levels. They've done it on sort of with a larger focus area, thinking about regional flows. Again, ecological processes. This is where we can see some flows between the Adirondacks and other green places nearby, like the Tug Hill and the Southern Greens. And they put those two things together into something called resilience. areas that are expected to have the highest possibility to persist and to continue their functionality and their integrity in the face of things like climate change and land use change. And the park as a whole, looks pretty good when you compare it to some nearby places, but we could also use this on smaller scales. And so I just point these out as resources that are out there, tremendous thinking that's been done by really smart people like Mark Anderson to already sort of prioritize and assess the Adirondacks on a landscape scale. We can also talk about individual towns. And I now know more about Brunswick, knowing where this probably came from. But Brunswick is a terrific example of a town that has been very forward-thinking. In addition to the general zoning that exists for the town of Brunswick, they have an overlay zone, which was put together with a lot of thought and some field work, getting out on the ground to identify some features of importance for that landscape, including things like high and moderate value wetlands, natural resource protection zones, wildlife corridors that they've identified and verified with some ground truthing, and wildlife habitat blocks. So that's one example of how a town might think about doing a site assessment at the level of their town. Another example from here in the Adirondacks is the town of Brighton, where we are now. Brighton got a grant to do a smart growth plan. They came to us a couple of years ago and asked us to help them out with that, just in terms of providing information. So we provided to them some of the resources that would be available to help them think about how to structure development and how to plan for development in their town, including things like land protection, water resources. We got some aquatic information from Hillary, core wildlife habitats, which we map on big scales, and anything that we had as far as modeled or observed or predicted wildlife observations. And so they now have that information available to them in terms of thinking about where they might want to and where they might not want to put development in the future. Then we can talk about the local scale, and I think this is most relevant to what Randall Arendt was just talking about, and here we get into that wonderful tool of conservation development. And here again, I think the opportunity where we can protect specific features, not just at the site scale that we've identified as being important on a particular area, but also on larger scales as we put these things together and think about their cumulative effect across the landscape, and we think about things like ecological connectivity. So this is going to be somewhat similar to what Randall was just showing you, but I just created a hypothetical example of what this might look like. And again, here we are in Brighton. This is an example I made a couple of years ago. But let's imagine that there's a 760-acre chunk of resource management in Brighton. Let's imagine that it's adjacent to wild forests and it's currently owned by a logging company. The developer can therefore market it as having adjacency to state land. There's some roads that they might be able to make use of already. Maybe the loggers can't afford to keep it anymore. So again, not an unlikely scenario for the Adirondacks, and one that we see relatively frequently in this landscape. We can look at it up close on an aerial photograph, and we can think about what the traditional design might be as the developer comes in and just takes that acreage and divides it up into however many lots he's trying to get, and quite often in some of these resource management areas, they might want to go for that large lot, backcountry, spread out style of development. We know that the park agency is going to map the wetlands and has already mapped the wetlands and the steep slopes. Everybody accepts that those are things that we're not going to be able to develop. So we know that we're starting from that standpoint. In a conservation design, however, let's say we also get out onto the landscape and identify some important features like rusty blackbird. Maybe it lives in one of these little peatlands. Maybe there's a gray jay there, or a broiled chickadee, or an owl-sided flycatcher. These are some of the rarest birds in the state that like these little peatland habitats that we happen to have all over the town of Brighton, actually. And say we can identify those as being important features because they're very rare birds and we care about keeping them around. Let's imagine that this chunk up here happens to be a really nice deer wintering area or moose wintering area. Let's imagine that we identify another site over here that has really old trees, or it is one of those habitat types that I pointed out to you as being particularly important for wildlife. Let's imagine that it's a chunk of central oak pine and it's only 2 acres and nobody would have caught it in any larger scale analysis. Then we can also step back and look back at the core area mapping that we did for Brighton, where we identified large blocks of unfragmented forest of at least, I think it was 150 acres. And we can see that the southeast corner of this chunk of resource management in Brighton happens to be in one of those core forest blocks. That's another tremendously valuable thing for wildlife and ecological connectivity. And we see that that's part of this landscape that we also might want to pay heed to. So we have the primary conservation features in the wetlands. We have secondary conservation features, which we also have identified as being important on this particular site. Again, a conventional development might have done something like this. In this case, instead, we would put the houses totally outside the primary conservation areas, maybe somewhat adjacent to the secondary conservation areas, but trying not to impact them in any way. And we would draw the lot lines last, leaving us with, the whole western area of the property that could be a common property for the enjoyment of the people that live in this particular subdivision. So I think we can talk about sort of a gradient of how you might want to do a natural resource inventory or a site assessment. And at one end of that, I think you have your basic strategy, your basic assessment, the bargain price assessment, maybe you might want to call it, in which we, of course, map the wetlands and the steep slopes because we know we have to do that. We give Heritage a call, stop over at the DEC office and say, hey, do you know anything about Bicknell's thrush or anything else that might be in this particular area? In this kind of scenario, most of the time, the scope of consideration is just the project site. The people that are involved outside of the folks that might go out there and delineate the wetlands is largely going to be engineers. At the other end of the spectrum, I think we can talk about the LEED Platinum assessment, or the gold standard assessment, in which, let's say we had the opportunity to do everything we might possibly want to do. In this scenario, I think we would not only consult local experts like DEC and Heritage, but we would also consult other sources of information on species occurrence data that might be available for the area, some of the mapping that I highlighted to you, all of those sort of regional scale maps I showed from TNC are publicly available. They can be downloaded and looked at if there's the capacity to do that. We would map the wetlands and the steep slopes, but we also would hopefully try to map some of the key surrounding features that we know are high importance and value to wildlife, like vernal pools. Chris Nowitzki talked about how we go in and we sort of mow down and make everything flat, and those little depressions are lost, and that has consequences for stormwater. It also has consequences for frogs that breed in those vernal pools. Those are not going to be mapped in any sort of scenario. You have to go in and to find them. Critical habitats, like some of the ones I've highlighted previously. Snags, I showed this to my husband, he said, snags? You mean like dead trees? I said, yeah. You don't think about that much in the Adirondacks because we have so many trees, but what looks like a hazard to us it looks like home to 30 or 40 different bird species that breed in there. So go through the spot if you can, and if you find a few that aren't going to be a hazard, by all means try to keep them there. Large core forest blocks, connectivity zones. We would want to be out in the field multiple seasons because we want to have some sense of the species that are present in all different times of the year. We would consider not just the site, but also its surroundings and the connectedness of the site to its surroundings. We might even do some analysis of alternative designs and map the ecological impact zones and look at how those would play out. And hopefully we would have involved in this scenario not just the engineers, but ecologists, naturalists, biologists, and others who have some knowledge of the area. So how do we get from where we are now to there? I think one of the best things that could come out of today would be a collective dialogue about what some of those triggers are, what is the size or the characteristics of a project that needs to trigger a site assessment, and of what level of quality, what are the pieces of that sort of gold standard site assessment that we would want to see most of the time, or even some portion of the time, and how do we make sure that those are happening. I think to the extent that we can start to have a conversation about that as a result of what we're talking about today, we have an opportunity to develop that standard and set that standard now. We are starting to realize, based on questions we've gotten from presenting our work at the APA, from looking into conservation development regs throughout all of the Northeast, that there's not a lot of good examples on the books of where these kinds of site assessments are actually required. Seldomly do they actually require that they are done by ecologists. Even more seldomly are they required to be done prior to the site design, prior to the layout of the lots. So I think we have an opportunity to change that and to develop some good guidelines. And we're hoping, just within our office, to develop sort of some standards that we would hope would go into something like this. And you should stay in touch with us if you'd like to be informed about when we have those developed. So to wrap up, I think there's of course challenges to this. The demand drives the supply of the kind of folks that are going to do this work. As I mentioned, it's not required in very many places that you would do anything like that. So there's not a lot of folks who are out there doing these kinds of large-scale analyses. Jerry Jenkins is the kind of guy that's made a career out of doing this, but he and his like are kind of few and far between. I would say that our regional and state information is not tremendously accessible in comparison to the neighboring states of Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine. All have some amazing programs based on private land habitat management and development and how to do it that have much better resources than we do. The Hudson River Estuary Program in New York, which is on the beach through the EC, does have some great resources as well. I think there's also issues of fairness, questions of who should pay for this. Is it fair to put this on the backs of the developers? I think we can ask the question of, if it costs a developer, I don't know, I'm making up these numbers, but if it costs a developer $100,000 to do the engineering for a particular site, what if we asked for 5% of that? I could do a lot with $5,000 on just with existing information. So I think that's one place to start. And we know that good information doesn't necessarily solve the capacity issue. The maps of terrestrial resilience and local connectivity, they're not, incredibly tangible and easy to use. And the question's been asked this morning, how many local planning boards have a GIS person or even a GIS system? We can help. We are an organization. We're an example of an organization that can certainly help, and I think there are others that can help, but there is a capacity issue both at the local level and at the APA level just to have the deal with some of these resources. That said, I think there are also opportunities. There is good information available that's already been developed. There are great models out there. There are a range of options and scales. We don't always have to have the gold standard, but maybe we take some key pieces of it and try to get more and more of it happening. And I think we have the opportunity to be a model again. And I'm just going to throw up a slide with resources of places you might go. And I would add our website to that as well. Thank you.
Resource she is, and her organization. We have next Dave Cox, chairman of the Town of Bay Planning Department. He's going to talk about their upland protection program called the Viewshed Protection Area. And I think they provided a model for the rest of the Adirondack Park. For anyone who's concerned about the stuff that's being built up on hillsides and ridges around the Adirondack, there is a way to deal with it. Dave?
The town of Bay is entirely within the Adirondack Park. We're in the northern part of Saratoga County. Our town is completely bisected by Great Saginaw Lake. And our greatest asset is our beautiful mountain scenery. One problem we had with our mountain scenery is clear cutting down by the road by individual property owners. Some property owners want to clear cut their entire property, regrade it all, and then build. That leaves a scar, as you can see in the background there from over a mile away. Close up, you can see that it is quite visible and will be for quite some time after building. We wanted to do something to control that. And also, you can see our beautiful mountain scenery here. If you look on the right-hand slide, in the background on the left side of the lake is a small hill called Gray Hill. We had a house go up on the hill, and fortunately for us, it is mostly visible only at nighttime. You can see the lights. On the right side of the lake, way down the last mountain before the lake takes a turn, is called Kloop Mountain. On that mountain, we had a developer come in and speak with our code enforcement officer. The developer wanted to put a subdivision on the side of the mountain. Our CEO talked to him, told him we needed at least minimum 150 feet frontage on a public road, depending on the zone that it's in, 200 feet or 300 feet in other parts of that mountain. Usually when the CEO tells the developers this information, they realize the tremendous cost involved with the infrastructure of building a public road on the side of a mountain, and they go away. But this developer didn't bat an eye, and when he left, the code enforcement officer fully expected him to come back with a subdivision plan. Nearby the town today, we also had houses built on top of the mountain. On the right-hand side is a picture taken from the county road showing the location of a house on top of the hill. On the left-hand side is a close-up. This particular property owner owned a logging business, and he had to clear cut an enormous amount of land on top of the mountain for his logging truck, a shed for all his construction equipment. And when we saw all these problems in our town and nearby, the town supervisor organized a committee to see what ought to be done to make sure that we protect our mountain scenery as best we could. When we got together, we found that we only had two main options. One was to take our zones, which varied from 60,000 square feet up to 3.2 acres, and then all the way up to 43 acres, and revise them so that there'd be decreased density on the mountains, make the lot size larger, so there'd be fewer houses on the mountainside. Or we could leave the zoning alone and try to mitigate the view of the houses that are built. And that will be by creating an overlay zone, overlay district. We looked around and we found several places that had already considered overlay zones. 20 miles away from the town today, the Lake George Park Commission had a draft overlay zone, which was never enacted by any of the towns within the Park Commission. However, they gave us a copy of their zone, of their draft law. We also consulted with Saratoga County Planning Department, and they supplied us with several existing overlay district laws. Some of these were in the Catskill Mountains and some farther west in the state. And we looked those over. Also, the APA staff provided us with a great deal of advice. Brian Grissy, their local government coordinator, met with us several times and gave us information that was very helpful. He also put us in contact with the APA mapping unit. That unit had a computer program that would take a spot on the mountain and find out where it was visible from anywhere on the lake or the roads surrounding the lake. They used that information to draw up a map of what could be seen from the lake, which is what we wanted to protect. Brian also put us in touch with Aaron Zeman because logging was an important issue for our mountainsides. We wanted to restrict clear cutting as best we could. We were using the APA standard of 25 acres of clear cut maximum in our town, and we thought that would look terribly obvious if it was clear cut on one of our mountains that was visible from the lake. So We used the information from APA and from all these other sources, and we put together a draft viewshed law. When we had our public hearing, our biggest concern from citizens at the hearing was on the logging issue. After the hearing, we met with several logging companies from the local area, and we were able to find out what their concerns were and to deal with those concerns. And we mutually agreed on a 5-acre maximum clear cut within the viewshed area. The 25 acres would still be applicable outside the viewshed area within the town. We also restricted, in order to control the clear cut and the clearing of individual lots by individual property owners, which was on the first slide that I showed you, by restricting non-commercial clear cutting, which would be clear cutting by individual property owners, to half an acre. That would provide enough area for drain fields and the footprint of the house. So, given that, we came up with this map that APA provided to us. The darker shade is the State Forest Preserve land. The lighter green shade is the mountainside area that is now within our viewshed protection zone. You can see that it covers quite a bit of ground there. After the viewshed law was passed, Murphy's Law says nothing's perfect and anything can happen. The winter after the law was passed within the town, we discovered this on top of one of our mountains, and it is within the viewshed area. We talked with our CEO to see how this happened, and he said that this property owner had a valid building permit before our Viewshed Act was passed, and even before the moratorium, which we had in effect while we were designing our Viewshed Act. So he just took his time building, and it wasn't obvious that it was up there until the winter after our viewshed law was passed. Fortunately, it's only visible in the winter, which this picture was taken. The deciduous trees that are in front of it make it visible in the winter, but it's completely covered and hidden in the summertime. Some other concerns after our law was passed, we had a property owner come in who owned property within the viewshed area, and he wanted to develop it into his home. We met with him. He flew a balloon at the height of his house, and we looked from lakeside, and we could see the balloon. So it was obvious that what he was going to build would be visible. And we discussed with him the requirements of the Viewshed Regulation staff, which include the color of the building, the reflectivity of the roof, of the siding, the reflectivity of the window glass, extensive landscaping to try to obscure the development as much as possible, and other things. The law itself is on the table outside, available for anyone interested. This particular homeowner went back and studied what was in front of him, and he hasn't come back in 2 years. We hear that he is going to build, but it will be in an area that is outside our viewshed protection area. After our law was passed, we had a committee. Our law law was passed in 2005. After we passed that, we had a committee formed to revise our comprehensive plan within the town. Part of that process involved a survey of all of our homeowners, both seasonal and year-round. We got a response from 50% of all the mailings that we sent, which was amazing. It's usually much less than that. The overwhelming response was to keep the town just as it is now, no new major development. So that reinforced the wisdom of our viewshed plan. We also heard that and found that APA was considering revising their clear-cut regulations. In some instances, the 25-acre maximum limit would be revised upwards. This isn't as bad as it seems because the logger that did that would have to belong to an organization that had good woodland practices and use sustainable forestry. But we think that APA ought to exempt areas that are special and have existing protection for them and make any laws within the park that regarding logging or cutting not be applicable in these areas. But we thank the park tremendously for all the support that they gave us throughout the development of our law. We couldn't have done it without them. I thank you all.
Our next, I should mention that out on the table there is information about the copy of this law that Dave was just talking about, this viewshed protection law, is available to anyone who's interested. Also, Carlton Montgomery has a very interesting excerpt from the Pinelands comprehensive plan on clustering. Clustering is spelled out in considerable detail in that part of New Jersey, and it leaves very little up to the discretion of the administering agency compared to what we have in the APA law, which I think are 2 lines that refer vaguely to clustering and leave things wide open. So anyway, our next speaker is Carlton Montgomery, and he's going to talk about some interesting models from the Pinelands that, oh, I'm sorry, I got it mixed up. It's Dave Gibson. Well, I've been getting Dave an awful tough time. I've given him the wrong title and everything, press release he sent out, but at least I got his name right, I think. It's Jim, is it? Oh, no, I'm sorry, it's Dave. Dave has been involved in Adirondack conservation work for a long time. He was executive director of the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks. He's now a partner in a new organization, and few people are more knowledgeable than he. And he's going to talk now about some good examples of things that the APA has done over the years. And the APA will be glad to hear this because it gets an awful lot of criticism for things that it does. And here we're going to do some praising, I think. I think you're on, Dave.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Dave. Thanks to Explorer. It's great to be here. My colleague Dan Plumley is right over here. Where's Dan? And we work for Adirondack Wild, Friends of the Forest Preserve, which reorganized in 2010 from an organization that Paul Schaefer founded in 1945. Called Friends of the Forest Preserve. So there's been a lot of advocacy in this history of the Adirondack Park, that's for sure. One thing, when we got started in 2010, we knew up ahead of us was a public hearing for the Adirondack Club and Resort. And this being the largest project anyone has ever seen in the park, Dan and I began to prepare, asked the park agency permission to join the hearing, and we joined the hearing. In the spring of 2011, Dan had the wisdom to begin to compile a list of prior projects, large projects that the agency had wrestled with over the course of its history. And large subdivisions in some cases, subdivisions of resource management and rural use, in some cases in low intensity use. And how did they handle those over the course of time? And how did they involve the public? Were they hearings? What was the level of their ecological analysis, if you will, to pick up on what Randall Arendt has shared with us and Haley today? So that's where we started. Dan began to compile this list of permits. And as the hearing wore on, we realized, Dan and I, that these were going to be pretty significant because they were precedent. And during the hearing, a very fine law judge, Dan O'Connell, who works with the EDC, but he did a fine job, as any of the parties would attest to that hearing, gave us, legitimized what we were asking for, which was the prior precedent of the agency had real value to that hearing. In fact, it was very important evidence that the agency should take into consideration in any final determination. What did the agency do in similar circumstances in the past? So we went at it. I use this time. And of course, underlying the agency's efforts all these years are these famous words from Section 805 of their law, which is, in this case, resource management areas. The green are those lands to protect, manage, enhance, all those great words. Open space resources, overriding natural resource considerations, and public considerations. The basic purpose is to protect the delicate physical and biological resources, encourage management of forest and agricultural and recreational resources, and preserve the open spaces essential, said the legislature, to the basic and unique character of the park. What has changed? Nothing has changed. And that's the same law today as it was. The legislature approved this in June of 1973. Then it says, will allow for residential development on substantial acreages or in small clusters of carefully selected and well-designed sites. The word design. Is the APA supposed to be doing conservation design? Of course it is. The legislature said it shall. Well-designed sites. Now, substitute a few words. I think Bob Glennon's here, but instead of substantial acreages in rural use, it says large acreages or large lots. And carefully selected, well-designed sites, that's the same language in rural use. So essentially, rural use and resource management have this obligation, when development is proposed, to meet those words. And how do we define those words, and how do we provide guidance to the agency staff to follow it up? That's the question. But it's in the law, and there's no, it's clear to Dan and I as we left the hearing in the late summer of 2011, that the APA has all the authority it needs in law to do good conservation design. So we looked at these prior permits. All of them, in our estimation, adhere to the basic purposes and policies in resource management, rural use, and the other land use classifications. Most were informed by some kind of natural resource inventory and assessment. Whether or not adequate, that's an ongoing debate. It has been a debate at the agency for years. But all these permits were informed by some manner of assessment on the site. All concentrated development in a relatively small area of the project site, relatively near existing infrastructure. During the hearing, if there was a hearing, many of these permits had a hearing, use the hearing process to eliminate lots, to choose alternative locations based on decisions to sustain ecosystems, avoid fragmentation of large forest habitats, and all maintain the vast majority of the acreage as undeveloped forest. So when Patton came to town in 1988, it had been to Vermont, It had exploited parts of Vermont, came over to New York State, and sought to develop raw lot acreages all over the park. This was one example in the town of Gregg with a nearly 3,000 acre raw lot subdivision. They wanted to back it up. They could mathematically be eligible under the overall intensity guidelines of the APA for over 200 principal buildings. The agency held a hearing. How many of those are held? Very rarely. Agency held a hearing. They denied the project. It was inconsistent with the purposes of the Act and the definition of rural use. The houses weren't clustered. This is all in the permit. Cumulative impacts of this and other projects could be significant and precedential. So they downsized the applicant, got the message, they downsized the project. A second hearing was held. The final permit reflected a lot of site analysis. There were trout streams, wetlands, deer wintering areas, forests,